The sun had just begun to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the small town of Maplewood. The streets were quiet, save for the occasional car passing by, and the flickering neon sign of Tom Sue's Diner stood out against the darkening sky. The diner, a staple of the community for generations, was known for its home-cooked meals and friendly atmosphere, or at least, that was its reputation. James pulled his rental car into the parking lot, grateful to have found a place to eat after a long day of meetings. He was a man of few words, always preferring to let his actions speak for him. Dressed in a tailored suit that hinted at his success, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned his place in the world. As he stepped out of the car and into the cool evening air, he took a deep breath, trying to shake off the exhaustion that had settled in his bones. The diner's bell jingled as James pushed open the door, the warm smell of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling bacon greeting him. Inside, the diner was a nostalgic slice of Americana red vinyl booths, checkered floors, and a jukebox playing soft rock from decades past. A handful of customers sat scattered around, engrossed in their meals or conversations. Behind the counter stood Tom and Sue, the owners of the diner and a couple well into their 50s. Tom was tall and broad-shouldered, with graying hair and a stern expression that softened only slightly when he smiled. Sue, on the other hand, was petite and warm-looking, her kind eyes hidden behind thick glasses. They were the picture of a hard-working couple who had built their lives around this diner. James made his way to an empty booth near the window and sat down, placing his briefcase beside him. He picked up the laminated menu, scanning it with mild interest. He wasn't picky; anything hot and filling would do after the day he'd had. Tom and Sue exchanged glances from behind the counter. Sue nudged Tom, who sighed heavily before approaching the booth where James sat. As Tom drew closer, the friendly smile that usually adorned his face was replaced by a tight-lipped frown. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, as if waiting for James to acknowledge his presence. James looked up, offering a polite smile. "Good evening. I'll have a cup of coffee to start, please." Tom hesitated, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Coffee, huh?" he muttered, glancing back at Sue, who was watching the exchange with a wary expression. "We're out of coffee," he said flatly. James raised an eyebrow. "Out of coffee? That's unusual for a diner." Tom shrugged, an air of indifference in his posture. "Yeah, well, we're closing soon anyway." James glanced at the clock on the wall. "It was only a little after 6. I thought you were open until 9. Tom shifted uncomfortably, not expecting to be questioned. "We're closing early tonight. You might want to try the place down the road." There it was, the subtle but unmistakable message that James wasn't welcome here. He felt the sting of it, a familiar burn that he had hoped was a thing of the past. But instead of letting it show, James simply nodded. "I see. Well, I'm here now, so if it's not too much trouble, I'd like to order dinner." Tom's frown deepened, and for a moment it looked like he might argue. But before he could, Sue called from behind the counter, her voice strained. "Tom, let it be. Just take the order." Tom's jaw tightened, but he turned back to James with a curt nod. "Fine. What'll it be?" James ordered a simple meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and a side of vegetables. Tom scribbled it down on his notepad with as little enthusiasm as possible, then walked back to the kitchen, muttering under his breath. James watched him go, the tension in the diner palpable. A few of the other customers had noticed the exchange, their eyes flicking between James and the couple behind the counter, but no one said anything. They simply went back to their meals, pretending not to see what was happening. James leaned back in the booth, folding his hands in his lap. He was used to this, too used to it, but he wasn't about to leave. Not yet. He had his reasons for staying, and they went far beyond just wanting a meal. The diner's atmosphere, once warm and inviting, had turned cold and tense. The soft chatter that had filled the room earlier was now reduced to hushed whispers, punctuated by the occasional clatter of cutlery. James remained seated, his eyes scanning the room, taking in the reactions of the other patrons. He could see their discomfort, the way they avoided looking at him directly, as if acknowledging the situation would make them complicit. Tom returned from the kitchen, placing James' meal in front of him with a thud that rattled the plate. The food looked as if it had been thrown together in haste, sloppy, unappetizing, and a far cry from the hearty meals the diner was known for. Tom didn't say a word as he placed the coffee James had ordered earlier next to the plate. He then turned and walked away, his shoulders stiff with barely concealed resentment. James stared at the food for a moment, then picked up his fork. He took a small bite, chewing slowly, his expression unreadable. He wasn't particularly hungry anymore, but he wasn't about to give them the satisfaction of walking out. He knew what was happening. He had seen it countless times before, in different places, under different circumstances. The faces might change, but the sentiment remained the same. Sue emerged from behind the counter with a pot of coffee, refilling the cups of the other customers, all while pointedly ignoring James. He noticed how her hands trembled slightly as she poured, betraying the tension she felt. James couldn't help but wonder what had driven this couple to behave this way. Was it fear? Hatred? Ignorance? Whatever the reason, it was clear that they had made up their minds about him the moment he walked through the door. As James continued to eat, the door to the diner opened, and a young couple walked in, laughing and chatting. They were in their 20s, fresh-faced and full of energy, clearly regulars. They greeted Tom and Sue warmly as they took a seat at the counter. Sue immediately brought them menus, her demeanor shifting to one of warmth and friendliness. The contrast was stark, and James couldn't help but notice how the young couple didn't even glance in his direction, as if he were invisible. James put down his fork, his appetite gone. He leaned back in the booth, his eyes narrowing slightly as he watched the scene unfold. It would have been so easy to leave, to walk out and find another place to eat, somewhere he might be treated with the respect he deserved. But he had learned long ago that walking away wasn't always the right choice. Sometimes, standing your ground was the only way to make a point. Sue moved behind the counter, stealing quick glances at James, as if expecting him to leave. When he didn't, she seemed to grow more agitated, wiping down the already clean counter with unnecessary force. The young couple at the counter exchanged a look, sensing the undercurrent of tension in the room. The woman leaned over to Sue and whispered something, casting a furtive glance in James' direction. Sue nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. James reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, his fingers tapping across the screen with practiced ease. He sent a few quick messages, then put the phone down on the table beside him, his expression calm and composed. He wasn't in a rush. He had all the time in the world. The bell above the door jingled again, and this time a middle-aged man in a worn leather jacket walked in. He was rough around the edges, with a weathered face and a no-nonsense demeanor. He looked around the diner, his gaze settling on James for a moment before moving on. He walked over to the counter, nodding at Tom. "Evening," Joe. Tom greeted him, his voice gruff. Joe nodded back, taking a seat on one of the stools. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice carrying just enough to be heard across the room. Tom hesitated, glancing over at James before replying. "Nothing you need to worry about." Joe raised an eyebrow, following Tom's gaze. He took in the scene, the uneaten meal, the tension in the air, and frowned. "Doesn't look like nothing," he muttered, his tone skeptical. Sue quickly intervened, forcing a smile. "Joe, can I get you something to eat?" Joe ignored her, his attention focused on Tom. "Why haven't you served the man properly?" he asked bluntly. The question hung in the air, heavy and charged. Tom's face flushed, his composure cracking for the first time. "I don't have to explain myself," he snapped, his voice low but filled with barely restrained anger. Joe's eyes narrowed. "You're right, you don't. But everyone here can see what's going on, Tom. This ain't right." A murmur rippled through the diner, the other customers shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Sue's forced smile faltered, and she shot a pleading look at Tom. But Tom wasn't backing down. He squared his shoulders, his eyes locking with Joe's. "I run this place the way I see fit," Tom said coldly. "If you don't like it, you know where the door is." Joe held Tom's gaze for a moment longer, then shook his head in disgust. "You're making a big mistake, Tom," he said quietly. He turned to James, his expression softening. "I'm sorry about this," he said, his voice sincere. "I don't know what's got into them." James gave him a small, appreciative nod. "Thank you, but it's all right," he replied calmly. "I'm not going anywhere." Joe sighed, his shoulders slumping. He looked around the diner, taking in the faces of the other customers, most of whom were avoiding his gaze. "Shame on all of you," he muttered, before turning and walking out the door, the bell jingling behind him. The silence that followed was thick, oppressive. James remained seated, his gaze steady, unyielding. He could feel the weight of the stares from the other customers, the tension in the air, growing with each passing second. But he didn't move. He wasn't finished here, not by a long shot. The night outside had settled into a deep, starless black, the only light coming from the dim street lamps lining the road and the glow from the diner's neon sign. Inside, the tension continued to build, a palpable force that seemed to thicken the very air. James sat quietly in his booth, his fingers lightly tapping the edge of the table as he waited. He was in no hurry. He knew that time was on his side. Tom and Sue, however, were growing more restless by the minute. Tom had retreated behind the counter, his face a mask of frustration and barely controlled anger. Sue busied herself with meaningless tasks, wiping down counters, rearranging sugar packets, anything to avoid looking at James. The few customers who remained in the diner ate in silence, their eyes darting between James and the couple, unsure of what would happen next. The door jingled again, and this time, a man in an expensive-looking suit stepped into the diner. He was tall, with a commanding presence and an air of authority that immediately drew attention. He glanced around the room, his eyes quickly finding James, and he smiled a warm, genuine smile that seemed out of place in the charged atmosphere of the diner. James, the man greeted, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear as he walked over to the booth. "It's good to see you." James looked up, his expression softening for the first time that evening. "David, you're right on time," he replied, standing to shake the man's hand. David turned to the rest of the diner, his smile unwavering. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said, though the way he held himself made it clear he didn't particularly care if he was. The other customers exchanged confused looks, unsure of what to make of this new arrival. Tom and Sue, however, seemed frozen in place, their faces paling as they realized who had just walked in. David was no ordinary man. He was the head of a major investment firm, a person of influence and power who had a reputation for getting things done. And more importantly, he was someone with whom Tom and Sue's diner had been hoping to do business. David's eyes flicked to Tom and Sue, his expression becoming more serious. "I'd like to have a word with you two," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Tom swallowed hard, stepping out from behind the counter with Sue following closely behind. They approached David and James, their earlier bravado evaporating in the face of the situation. "Mr. Jenkins," Tom began, but David held up a hand, cutting him off. "Save it," David said sharply. "We both know what's going on here, and I'm not interested in excuses." Sue's eyes darted to James, then back to David. "It's just a misunderstanding," she tried to explain, her voice trembling. "We didn't mean any harm." James remained silent, letting David take the lead. This was a moment he had been waiting for, a chance to see how they would handle the truth. It was clear that Tom and Sue were beginning to realize the gravity of their mistake, but James wanted to see if their regret was genuine or just a reaction to the potential consequences they now faced. David's expression softened slightly, but there was no mistaking the disappointment in his eyes. "This isn't just about you refusing to serve a customer," he said. "It's about how you've chosen to treat someone based on nothing more than the color of their skin. And that, my friends, is not something I can overlook." Tom and Sue exchanged a panicked glance, their earlier confidence completely shattered. They had never imagined that their actions would lead to this, that the man they had so casually dismissed would turn out to be someone important, someone connected to their own business interests. "We didn't know who he was," Tom blurted out, desperation creeping into his voice. "If we had known." James finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "It shouldn't matter who I am. Everyone deserves to be treated with respect, regardless of their status or background." The words hung in the air, a stark reminder of the core issue at hand. Tom and Sue had been so wrapped up in their own biases that they had failed to see the person in front of them as a human being worthy of dignity and kindness. David nodded in agreement. "Exactly. And that's why I'm here, to make sure this kind of behavior doesn't go unchallenged." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "Tom, Sue, I was seriously considering investing in your diner's expansion. But after what I've seen tonight, I'm not so sure anymore." Sue's eyes filled with tears, her voice cracking as she tried to plead their case. "Please, Mr. Jenkins, we'll make it right. We'll apologize. We'll do whatever it takes. Just don't pull your investment." Tom looked down at the floor, the weight of his actions finally beginning to settle on him. He knew that without the investment, their plans to expand the diner, to make it something truly special, would crumble. The realization that his own prejudices had led them to this point was a bitter pill to swallow. James watched them, his expression unreadable. He had seen this kind of reaction before, people scrambling to make amends when they realized they might lose something valuable. But he was looking for more than just a superficial apology. He wanted to see real change, a genuine acknowledgement of the harm that had been done. David crossed his arms, his gaze unwavering. "It's not just about the money, Tom. It's about trust. And right now, I'm not sure I can trust you to run a business that treats all of its customers with the respect they deserve." The silence that followed was heavy, the implications of David's words sinking in. Tom and Sue stood there, unable to meet his eyes, knowing that their future now hung in the balance. The silence in the diner was broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional clink of a fork against a plate. Tom and Sue stood frozen, their faces etched with the realization that everything they had worked for could be slipping away. The other patrons, who had been covertly watching the unfolding drama, now stared openly, their curiosity mingling with a sense of unease. James, still calm and composed, returned to his seat, his eyes fixed on Tom and Sue. He wasn't looking for revenge or retribution, he was looking for something far more valuable, a moment of understanding, a chance for them to see the error of their ways. David remained standing, his arms crossed, waiting for a response from the couple. The tension was almost unbearable, the weight of their decision pressing down on them. Finally, Tom broke the silence, his voice shaky but determined. "Mr. Jenkins," he began, glancing nervously at James before continuing, "WE made a mistake. A terrible mistake. I see that now." His voice cracked, and he swallowed hard, struggling to keep his composure. "I don't know what came over us. We were wrong to treat you the way we did, and I'm truly sorry." Sue nodded fervently, her eyes glistening with tears. "We've always prided ourselves on being good people, on running a place where everyone feels welcome," she added, her voice trembling. "But tonight we failed. We let our fears and prejudices get the better of us, and for that, we're deeply ashamed." James listened to their apologies, his expression still inscrutable. He could hear the sincerity in their voices, the desperation to make things right. But words, he knew, were only the beginning. True change would require more than just an apology. It would require action, a commitment to being better. David's stern expression softened slightly as he listened to Tom and Sue's pleas. He could see the regret in their eyes, the genuine fear of losing everything they had built. But he wasn't ready to let them off the hook just yet. "Apologies are a good start," David said slowly, his tone measured. "But they're not enough. You need to prove that you've learned from this experience, that you're willing to change how you run this business. Because if you don't, you'll find that people won't just walk away from your diner, they'll walk away from you." Tom nodded quickly, his eyes wide with desperation. "We'll do whatever it takes, Mr. Jenkins. We'll make sure nothing like this ever happens again. We'll change our policies, retrain our staff, even bring in diversity training if we have to. Just please, give us a chance to make it right." Sue reached out, her hand trembling as she touched David's arm. "Please," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "This diner is our life. We can't lose it. We can't." David looked down at her hand, then back at her face, searching for any sign of insincerity. But all he saw was fear and regret, a genuine fear of losing something precious, and a deep regret for the actions that had brought them to this point. James watched the exchange, his own thoughts churning. He had seen this kind of desperation before, but it was rare to see such open admission of wrongdoing. Most people, when confronted with their prejudices, would dig in their heels, refuse to acknowledge their faults. But here were Tom and Sue, standing before him, willing to do whatever it took to make amends. After a long, tense silence, James finally spoke. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a quiet strength that commanded attention. "Change isn't easy," he began, his eyes locking onto Tom's. "But it's necessary. If you're serious about making things right, then you need to start by recognizing that this isn't just about one bad night. It's about the attitudes and beliefs that led you to act the way you did, and those don't change overnight. Tom nodded, his face pale. We understand, he said quietly. We'll do whatever it takes. James paused, considering his next words carefully. I believe in second chances, he said finally. But only if they're earned. You need to show that you're committed to treating everyone who walks through those doors with the respect they deserve, no matter who they are. If you can do that, then maybe, just maybe, you'll be able to rebuild the trust you've lost. Sue's tears spilled over, but she smiled through them, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. Thank you, she whispered, her voice filled with gratitude. Thank you for giving us a chance. David nodded in agreement, his stern demeanor softening further. I'll be keeping an eye on you, he warned, his tone still firm. This isn't just about your business, it's about how you choose to live your lives from here on out. If I hear even a whisper of this kind of behavior happening again, you can consider my investment gone. Tom and Sue both nodded vigorously, their relief palpable. You won't regret it, Tom promised, his voice filled with determination. We'll make you proud. James leaned back in his seat, a small smile playing on his lips. Let's hope so, he said, his tone lighter now. Because if you do, this diner could become a place where everyone feels welcome, a place that truly reflects the values you claim to stand for. The tension in the room finally began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of cautious optimism. The other patrons, who had been watching the scene unfold, slowly returned to their meals, the earlier unease fading into the background. It was as if the diner itself had taken a deep breath, ready to start anew. But James knew that the real work was only just beginning. Tom and Sue had taken the first step, but there were many more to go. Whether they would rise to the challenge or fall back into old habits remained to be seen. But for now, there was hope, a fragile, tentative hope that maybe, just maybe, things could change for the better. The atmosphere in the diner had shifted, though the underlying tension still lingered in the air like a faint but persistent odor. Tom and Sue retreated behind the counter, exchanging quiet words as they began to clean up, their movements slow and deliberate, as if weighed down by the gravity of what had just transpired. The other patrons, sensing that the drama had come to an end, began to quietly finish their meals, the murmur of conversation gradually returning to the space. James remained seated, his hands wrapped around the warm mug of coffee that Tom had hastily brought him earlier. He hadn't touched it yet, and now he lifted it to his lips, taking a slow, thoughtful sip. The bitterness of the coffee matched the bitter taste that lingered in his mouth from the night's events. But as he sat there, watching the couple who had wronged him scramble to make amends, he felt something shift within him, a subtle but profound sense of satisfaction. David, who had taken a seat across from James after their intense exchange with Tom and Sue, leaned back in his chair, studying his friend. You handled that well, he said quietly, his voice carrying just enough for James to hear. James shrugged, his gaze still fixed on the couple behind the counter. I've been in situations like this before, he replied softly. It never gets easier, but you learn how to manage it. David nodded, understanding the deeper implications of James' words. I think they got the message, he observed. They're scared. And sometimes, fear is a powerful motivator for change. James turned his attention back to David, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Fear can only take them so far, he said. What they do next will determine if they really understand the lesson, or if they're just trying to save face. As they spoke, the door to the diner opened once more, and a small group of people entered. They were dressed in business attire, their polished shoes clicking against the checkered floor as they made their way toward James and David. The leader of the group, a tall woman with an air of authority, approached the booth with a warm smile. Mr. Parker, Mr. Jenkins, she greeted them, her voice professional but friendly. I'm glad we could catch you before you left. We've just arrived from the meeting downtown. James stood to greet her, shaking her hand firmly. Glad you could make it, Sarah, he said, his tone polite but formal. This is David Jenkins, the head of the investment group we've been discussing. David also stood, offering his hand. A pleasure to meet you, Ms. Carter, he said, his demeanor equally professional. The group exchanged pleasantries, the tension from earlier now replaced with the buzz of business, as the conversation shifted to the development project that had initially brought James to town. It was clear that James was no ordinary diner patron. He was a key player in the town's future, and his influence extended far beyond the walls of this small establishment. Tom and Sue watched from behind the counter, their expressions a mixture of regret and awe as they realized just how significant James truly was. This man, whom they had so carelessly dismissed, held the power to shape the town's economic landscape, and they had nearly alienated him entirely. It was a sobering thought, one that left them feeling both foolish and deeply humbled. As the business conversation continued, Tom finally mustered the courage to approach the table, his steps hesitant but determined. He cleared his throat, drawing the attention of James, David, and the others. "Excuse me," Tom began, his voice shaky but sincere. "I just wanted to apologize again for how we treated you tonight, Mr. Parker. It was wrong, and there's no excuse for it." James looked up at Tom, his expression unreadable. The group around the table fell silent, waiting to see how James would respond. "Thank you, Tom," James said after a moment, his voice steady. "I appreciate your apology, and I hope you understand that what happened tonight is something that needs to be addressed, not just with words, but with actions." Tom nodded, his face flushed with both embarrassment and determination. "We will," he promised. "We'll do everything we can to make sure this place is welcoming to everyone, no matter who they are." Sue joined her husband, standing beside him with a solemn expression. "We've already started thinking about the changes we need to make," she added. "We want to be better. We have to be better." James studied them both for a long moment before nodding. "I believe you," he said finally. "But like I said before, change doesn't happen overnight. It's something you'll have to work at every single day." Tom and Sue nodded in unison, their faces reflecting a mixture of relief and determination. "We will," Tom repeated, his voice firm. Satisfied, James extended his hand to Tom, who shook it gratefully, followed by Sue. It was a simple gesture, but it held the promise of a new beginning, a chance to move forward with a commitment to doing better. David, who had been quietly observing the exchange, smiled and patted James on the back. "You've given them something to think about," he said approvingly. "Now it's up to them to make good on it." James nodded, but his thoughts were already turning to the future. The events of the night had left a mark on everyone involved, and while he couldn't predict what would happen next, he knew that he had done his part. Whether Tom and Sue would truly change remained to be seen, but for now he was content with the knowledge that he had stood up for what was right. The clock on the wall ticked steadily as the night wore on, the once bustling diner now beginning to empty out. The group of business people who had joined James and David at the table wrapped up their conversation, exchanging business cards and firm handshakes before heading out into the cool night air. The atmosphere in the diner had shifted again, this time toward a quiet, reflective calm. James watched them leave, his thoughts lingering on the events of the evening. The confrontation with Tom and Sue, though tense, had ultimately been a step in the right direction, a necessary moment of reckoning that had exposed the deep-seated issues that still lingered in places like this. He knew that the path forward wouldn't be easy, but he hoped that his actions tonight had planted a seed of change. David stood beside James as they both prepared to leave. "You know," David said thoughtfully, "it's nights like these that remind me why we do what we do. It's not just about the business deals or the investments, it's about making sure that the places we invest in reflect the values we believe in." James nodded, his gaze still fixed on the door through which the last of the group had just exited. "You're right," he replied. "And it's about holding people accountable. If we don't stand up to this kind of behavior, then we're complicit in allowing it to continue." As they made their way to the door, Tom and Sue emerged from behind the counter, approaching James one last time. This time their demeanor was different, not just apologetic, but genuinely introspective. They seemed to have spent the last few minutes reflecting deeply on what had happened, and there was a new determination in their eyes. "Mr. Parker," Sue began, her voice steady, though still tinged with regret. "Before you go, we just wanted to say one more thing." James turned to face them, waiting patiently. "We know that words aren't enough," Sue continued, "but we wanted you to know that we're going to start making changes right away. We're not just going to wait and hope things get better, we're going to take action." Tom nodded in agreement. "We've already decided to reach out to a local diversity consultant to help us with training, and we're going to start working on policies that ensure everyone who walks through that door is treated with respect and dignity." James listened, his expression softening slightly as he heard the sincerity in their voices. It was clear that they had been shaken by the events of the evening, but more importantly, they seemed genuinely committed to making a change. "That's a good start," James said, nodding approvingly. "But remember, change is a process. It's going to take time, and you'll need to be consistent in your efforts. But if you're serious about this, you'll find that people will notice, and they'll appreciate the effort." Tom and Sue exchanged a look, a silent agreement passing between them. "We are serious," Tom said firmly. "We've learned a lot tonight, and we know we have a long way to go. But we're ready to do the work." James extended his hand once more, and this time Tom and Sue shook it with a renewed sense of purpose. It was a handshake that signified not just an apology, but a commitment to growth and improvement. As James and David finally left the diner, stepping out into the crisp night, a sense of closure settled over James. He had faced down prejudice and ignorance, not with anger or bitterness, but with the quiet strength of someone who knew his worth and demanded respect. And in doing so, he had left a lasting impact on a small corner of the world. The neon sign of the diner flickered faintly as they walked away, its glow casting long shadows on the pavement. It was a symbol of the old ways, of the deep-rooted biases that still lingered in places like Maplewood. But as James glanced back at the sign, he saw it not just as a relic of the past, but as a reminder of the potential for change. Even the most stubborn fixtures of society could be reformed, given the right push. David looked over at James as they walked toward their cars. "What's next for you?" he asked, his tone light, but with a hint of curiosity. James smiled slightly. "There's always more work to be done," he replied. "But for tonight, I think I'll head back to the hotel and get some rest. It's been a long day." David chuckled. "You've earned it, my friend. But don't forget we've got more meetings lined up tomorrow. The work never stops." James nodded, but there was a peacefulness in his eyes that hadn't been there earlier. "I wouldn't have it any other way," he said. As they parted ways, James took one last look at the diner, the lights glowing softly in the distance. He knew that change wouldn't come overnight, but he also knew that he had done his part to push it forward. And that, he decided, was enough. The night was quiet as he drove back to his hotel, the road stretching out before him like a long, winding path toward an uncertain future. But as he drove, James felt a sense of hope, a belief that, despite the challenges, progress was possible. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. And sometimes that's all it takes to make a difference.